It's saying live on YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not actually live yet because there's a bit of a lag. It takes about 30 seconds. It's now live on YouTube. And the way you can see it,
It's good. It's fine.
Live on YouTube now.
have you got Teams up?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe I copy paste the question to Teams. Is it easier for you? So Bhaskar can also see them then?
Yeah, Teams will be good.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in that group of ours, this one.
Okay, so here's the YouTube link. Can you just...
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, it's there.
It's there.
I've put my YouTube off. Is it still broadcasting? So can you click the link and see what you see?
Yeah, it's running now, but there's a bit of a lag.
Yeah, so it's behind, and you'll start getting an echo as well. So that's the reason I put it off, because I was getting myself coming back in an echoey way. So this confirms that it's live on YouTube now.
Yeah.
And anyone can see it with that link.
Yeah.
So I could tweet that now.
We can tweet it.
Okay, no, you can tweet it, but then stop our videos and just show this one slide. You know,
yeah. So put the holding slide up.
And the speakers.
Yeah. Oh.
You didn't make that?
No.
Okay,
sorry.
I'll do it now. I'll send it to you in 2 minutes.
Yeah. So if you put that up as the holding slide.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay, I'm now monitoring the YouTube on my phone.
I'm assuming the waiting room is enabled in this.
Let me just check. Yeah, it must be. I don't think there's anyone waiting at the moment.
No, but just that the...
Do you want the logo on it as well? The university logo that Bhaskar sent?
If you can, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I sent it via Teams.
Can you put it up or
like as my screen? Yeah.
No. How does this work? How do you?
What would you
How do we put up a holding background?
Is it on PowerPoint?
I thought it's just a slide so that you share your screen so that
you share your screen.
Just so see this.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Of course, it's perfect.
Is it a PowerPoint?
It's a
PowerPoint. So then just do it on a slideshow, and then share that screen.
Okay.
Did I send it?
On Teams? No. Or maybe it hasn't come. Yes.
Okay.
So I'll just download that. Hi, Helena. You're muted. But,
Okay. So is this okay, or do you want to format it differently? I mean, the information is there, right?
Yeah, just put it. I think stick it up and then.
I think it's fine. I'll just.
Okay.
Spelling, have you corrected?
No, I'm just correcting it now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Thanks. You have to do it in very quickly. So I think Elena's name has that.
Yeah, the
That's
thing
okay.
over the N. Yeah.
So, I know this is weird, but I can't see a share screen option, Bhaskar.
Show me.
Wait, let me do it.
Share screen? This?
Oh.
Yeah.
It's
okay. It's okay.
Okay. But now you can see this as well, no?
Make it full screen or save it as a PPTX.
No, that's good.
Sorry,
that's good.
PDF.
That's good.
Okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You know what? I'm also stressed.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you. I can see all our speakers are here. Thanks.
Great.
Do you have anything technical wise that you need to share? Do you have slides or no? Yeah. Okay. Great. So we're thinking we'll start 2:05 because we do have just over 90 people registered. So just in case everyone comes at 2, we'll need a few minutes to let them in. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I think we'll start now because it's 5 past and maybe people can just join in. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Cambridge Geography Seminar Series, Geographies of Work, Livelihood Transformations in the Pandemic and Beyond. I'm Shreya and I will be chairing today's session. So before we begin, we need to inform you that we are going to be recording the audio and the video of this session, which would be made available for viewing on the Cambridge Geography website.
Oh, Phil.
A few.
The reason I can't watch those videos.
Sorry. Okay. Website. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please don't use your audio or video during the session. And just a couple of housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphone switched off when the panel starts to minimize noise in the call. We want the session to be as interactive as possible, so feel free to ask questions in the chat at any time. And in the last 20 minutes of the session, we'll have an open discussion where you can ask questions and the panelists can respond. When asking a question or making a comment, please be considerate and respectful. So the Department of Geography is convening a program of research on decent work and youth livelihoods with a focus on the Global South. And this is concerned with the challenges in responding to the growing crisis of unemployment, working poverty, and livelihoods in low and middle income countries. The COVID-19 pandemic's serious impact on the world of work, of course, then directly speaks to this agenda. And we've taken this as an opportunity to ask how has the pandemic reinforced or challenged our understandings of work, working lives and livelihoods. And this is a 4-part seminar series where we take environment, technology, global markets, and civic potency as the anchoring themes for our discussion. The topic for today's discussion is work and global value chains. And we're very pleased to be joined by 3 wonderful speakers. Our first speaker is Ashok Kumar, who is lecturer in international political economy in the Department of Management, Birkbeck, University of London. He's recently published a book, Monopsony Capitalism, which focuses on the garment and footwear value chains, and where he explores the combination of capital's changing composition and labor's subjective agency to examine whether the waning days of the sweatshop have indeed begun. Our second speaker is Elena Perez Nino. She's a lecturer in political economy of development at the Center of Development Studies, University of Cambridge. Helena's research interests are in the political economy of development and agrarian change, and her current work looks at the expansion of tobacco leaf production through contract farming arrangements in Southern Africa and its implications for agricultural export sectors, rural development, and processes of class formation. Our third speaker is Matthew Amengual, who is Associate Professor in International Business at the Said Business School, Oxford. Matthew's research is rooted in comparative political economy and focuses on regulation, Latin American politics, and global labor standards. He's the author of the book, Politicized Enforcement in Argentina, Labor and Environmental Regulation, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. So without further ado, I invite our speakers to give us 5 to 10 minute pitches and their thoughts on these issues. And I'll start alphabetically with Ashok and then Helena and then Matthew. That's okay. Thanks.
Thank you for this invitation to Shreya and
What
others.
was I on that for? No, I could just go into my I'll go into my Zoom through here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I don't know how many people know about value chains, but I guess I'll basically try and, in the time that's allocated, explain a little bit about it. Kind of the original sort of schemata, the model of commodity chains from someone by the name of Gary Jeffrey and others in the 90s, divided it into 2 kinds of value chains, which then sort of governs the entire network of production, and then also the bargaining power of workers, or where workers sit within that. So you had producer-driven value chains, which were kind of technologically advanced, vertically integrated, with a higher degree of monopoly power, therefore kind of higher barriers to entry. So it costs more to enter those fields. And that was sort of automobiles, aeronautics. And the consequence of that was that workers had greater disruptive power and therefore greater bargaining power, right? Whereas in the other end of the spectrum, you had buyer-driven supply chains, which are sort of garment, footwear, toys, furniture, so on and so forth, which are low value, low technology, and therefore low barriers to entry. So it doesn't cost a lot of, it doesn't cost a lot for an emergent capitalist to enter those sectors. So there's a high degree of monopsony power. So, more power for the buyers versus the suppliers. And therefore, consequently, workers in these sectors had very little disruptive power and therefore little bargaining power. And so this is one of the explanations for the durability of a sweatshop or sweatshop conditions in these sectors. So the division between the more technologically advanced and more kind of centralized forms of production in which workers had more bargaining power versus the places that were decentralized and had smaller, less technologically advanced, reveals to us what direction, if a value chain, if it's moving in a certain direction, what the consequences for workers are. So if you had, firms in the sector where the suppliers are more expendable to buyers, very powerful buyers, workers too are expendable in those sectors, right? This isn't a kind of neoclassical argument. It's not that workers get what they deserve. It's more a kind of class struggle argument that workers get what they demand from what is available. So when sort of workers made demands in these sectors for the last 50 years, because those sectors were in sectors in which suppliers had very low margins and had low barriers to entry, those contracts would be lost and those factories would shut down. It was as simple as that. Because any demands in which labor was the primary variable meant that the cost would go up to the point where they wouldn't contract with them. Okay, that's a quick overview. This isn't a plug for my book, but basically, if you're interested in this, it's quite outlined quite comprehensively in there. But there's a kind of logic to the value chain, and it goes in a certain direction. It goes towards consolidation, like all of capitalism more generally. But in the supply chain, what happened is that you had in these sectors, it was completely shaped by this high degree of monopsony power in which these buyers had lots and lots of power over thousands and thousands of suppliers, a few buyers. But once you had the kind of liberalizing of borders, what happened was that this degree of monopsony power increases because you have more suppliers that buyers had access to. What that did over time was that increased competitive pressure on suppliers, and this led to the consolidation of suppliers in certain parts of the sector. So the most valorizable parts of the sector. So like I'm thinking of sort of denim or shoes. And what this did was increase this consolidation, ended up increasing the disruptive power of workers in those sectors that were increasing their kind of monopoly power, right? And this is particularly the case since the end of this global agreement in 2005, and then subsequently the sort of lowering of that supply of the degree of monopoly power in around 2010. Okay, now let's bring us to COVID. COVID should be kind of seen in terms of value chain questions as a kind of crisis. I mean, I'm reminded of sort of George Lukasz's text, History and Class Consciousness, in which he says that a crisis makes visible capitalism in its totality. And I think COVID is both makes visible this relation, this change, this trend within the supply chain, but also catalyzes it, right? So if you look at a number of cases in the garment sector, in a number of sort of labor-rich countries in which garments are produced, look at garments in Bangladesh, for example. Since the pandemic began, you've seen global demand actually plummet. Brands and retailers have bailed on a number of suppliers, and factories have had to shut down. They've laid off over 1 million workers, which is a quarter of the garment sector in Bangladesh. But in late May, the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Exports Association, which is the country's largest trade group for garment workers, began threatening major brands like, the EWM group, which owns brands like Jaeger and Peacock, with blacklisting if they didn't pay the workers, pay the suppliers what they'd owed them, right? What that reveals is that you have a sort of, it's kind of unprecedented in the sector in the sense that you have this increasingly assertive supplier organizations, not just in Bangladesh. You saw similar things happen in Cambodia with the Garment Manufacturers Association of Cambodia. It was less strident as the Bangladesh Association, but they also made similar demands that people honor their contracts. And also in Korea, you saw that supplier groups, basically over the bankruptcy of Forever 21, and that 15 suppliers were owed over $100 million. They started making demands similar to the association in Bangladesh, and those demands were ones in which they also were suggesting that they were going to blacklist, and that ends up it meant that those brands began negotiating with those suppliers. So the pandemic, also, if you look at what happened similarly with Leicester, you had a shift because of the liabilities that were associated with global value chains. You had, an increased amount of domestic production. So the Leicester garment sector is one case in point of this, in which the quick turnaround times meant that there was, that obviously the wages there were depressed, but even if the associated costs were slightly larger, the liabilities were less because of just the disruption to the supply chain was less. So what you see is that the pandemic both reveals the sort of increased power of suppliers in the value chains, but also it kind of catalyzes the increased power or force of competition, which leads to consolidation and greater barriers to entry. A crisis in capitalism ends up sort of, you end up seeing weaker capitals become dispossessed, and you see stronger capitals become more consolidated. The question is, what does that consolidation do? And it's a mixed story. Consolidation can both undermine workers' power because you have the ability of this now monopolistic firm to put downward pressure, to have the political power to sort of garrison their factories, like you saw with the Huyen case in 2014 in China, largest shoe producer in the world. But then at the same time, it means that workers can make greater demands on higher margin suppliers and have greater disruptive potential because buyers then can't replace them with other suppliers because these consolidated firms are so central in the supply chain. So I guess I'll end it with there. This basically what this means is that the increased centrality of the surviving suppliers, again, increases the disruptive potential and therefore the bargaining power of workers in this sector.
Thanks, Ashok, and thanks also for keeping to time. Our next speaker is Helena. So over to you.
Thank you, Shreya. And I'll tackle the question that you offered for provocation a bit differently, because I'll focus more on my area of interest, which is agricultural export production in Southern Africa, and broadly the type of workers that are engaged in these networks and in these chains. For the most part, unenumerated household workers, migrant, seasonal migrant workers, and piecemeal, and for the most part, informal workers. And to look a little bit at how the dynamics of the crisis impact on them, and to what extent do we know anything about this. And for this, I find extremely useful a model that the OECD has proposed. It's not rocket science, it just layers the crisis or segments its analysis in three different dimensions. There is evidently a health impact, which already tells us a little bit about the increased vulnerability of densely populated urban areas and places that are more affected by inequality or have a dense population of the elderly or the immunocompromised. There's a range of economic impacts, and here we know that the areas that are more exposed to global value chains are also more vulnerable. And lastly, there's a range of fiscal impacts or longer-term effects that certain constraints in state revenue will likely elicit. And there's a range of caveats about the different timings, the sequencing, and the lagged effects between these impacts in these very different spheres. So if you allow me, the two things that I want to discuss today is an attempt to dispel two ideas that I find in the commentaries about the crisis and that I find particularly unhelpful. The first one is the idea that people living in the rural areas and workers in global value chains or traded sectors that are in rural areas are less vulnerable to the pandemic. And I'll go into a bit more detail about what is problematic with that idea. And the second one, and you find it again in the commentaries widely spread, is the idea that people that are straddling paid work and on-account farming, or that have a very limited exposure or limited engagement with paid work, or for instance, recent migrants or recent proletarianized population could find protection from the crisis by returning to their areas of origin. I think this is problematic for a range of reasons. Firstly, and evidently, it's clear that the impact or the so-called protection that rural areas may experience may protect them from the health impact, but says very little about the possible economic or fiscal impact of the crisis. There is even a very influential commentator proposing that urban dwellers that have connections to the rural areas may be protected by their family members' ability to send them food, which I think fundamentally misunderstands how contemporary economics function, and the fact that in large swathes of the agricultural work, agriculture production is only made possible by remittances that are sent from in the other direction. So I think there's a tendency or a fallacy in thinking that the rural areas somehow exist outside global market determinations and pressures. And an inability to see the extent to which not only the jobs, but the many other influences of global production networks really penetrate rural areas and have transformed them beyond recognition and in ways that are frequently irreversible. And here I think that most commentators fail to recognize the ways in which production at different levels in agriculture is become far more dependent on private market players at the level of inputs, but also irrigation and many other processes, outputs, marketing outlets, so on and so forth. But also the way this economic articulation and integration to market has created an interdependence that cuts both ways and that is not so simply reversible. And it brings to my attention something that a Vietnamese researcher asking workers, and in Vietnam you have something like 2 million, almost 3 million garment workers, of which at least half a million have lost their job in a country that had no health or not a large health impact due to the crisis. And so the researcher asks the workers that have been recently dismissed, why is it that they don't return to the villages of origin? And the response was quite clear. This return has not been possible for a long time. And they said, why do you think we left and we came here for to begin with? So looking at these 3 layers and looking at what may be happening to agricultural workers in Southern Africa, but largely in the sourcing regions of agricultural commodities in the world, there's obviously quite a lot of uneven impact in terms of health. We don't really know, and it's clearly we don't yet have data that can allow us more certain assertions. For instance, we don't even know how to explain the fact that so far Africa has has remained the country with the continent with fewer deaths and fewer infections. And there's ideas about how its demographic structure may protect it, about how even the densely populated urban areas. There's been a recent debate about this in the Twitter sphere, and quite interesting, and I recommend you looking at it. But the reality is that we don't have an account to explain kind of like this specific development. And as a consequence of this, we know even less about how the impact of the crisis and how the whole pandemic may be affecting specifically these unenumerated informal workers in agrarian and agricultural global value chains. And so here kind of like the idea or that I'm going to put forward is very originally, we just don't know yet. It may be the case not only that, or not that the crisis was less impactful than expected in sub-Saharan Africa, but that it's unfolding much slower. There are, however, some aspects that should make us question a bit the relative vulnerability of rural areas and the workers and the work process that take place in these regions, because we know, at least for sub-Saharan Africa, these are areas that concentrate the elderly and the infirm, that are areas that are receiving returning migrants, that are regions that have less diversified economies and are more dependent on a few commodities, so on and so forth. What is, I think, quite interesting and relevant is to note that whereas Africa has been the continent that has been so far less impacted by the crisis in health terms, it is clear by now that it will be the continent that will experience the largest contraction, and that most jobs and most of the poverty reduction gains that will be lost as a consequence of the crisis will be concentrated in Africa. And so here we have kind of like the economic impact in more fleshed out, countries that perhaps are less exposed to tradable sectors, but their exposure to these global value chains is more impactful, and have a lower degree of specialization, so very small room for accommodation and adaptation. But in large, we know that the global trade system relies extensively on this type of forms of outsourcing production to the global south, and the very active incorporation of cheap labor. And that in these periods of crisis, we see how the costs of the crisis are transferred to the workers and produce this reproductive squeeze that we will probably be seeing when we start having more information about the actual impacts of the crisis. We know for a fact that these are economies that are characterized by types of jobs that require mobility, that are seasonal and migrant in essence, that this mobility is very much predicated more on personal relations and social proximity, and therefore incompatible with ideas of social distancing. We also know that there's a dearth of programs tackling the likely social effects of this economic crisis, that whatever programs are in place have a very poor capacity to target the poorest workers in rural areas, and that this lack of support in developing countries is compounded by the fact that a lot of these producers are competing against countries where such protections are in place. So this is all contributes to this idea that this greater interconnectedness and interdependence brought by globalization in a way comes back to bite countries in periods of crisis. And finally, to wrap up on the fiscal impact, we know that there it will be an important fall in the state revenue. There's obviously an increased demand on expenditure and funds that are critically redirected away from those type of interventions that may target and maybe helping rural, informal, and unenumerated workers. But also sometimes targeted to fund very expensive interventions such as ventilators or the setup of hospitals that not only will most likely fail to reach the rural poor, but will detract from the measures that could reach the rural poor. And with this, I will conclude. I think that what we're seeing is a very typical attempt by capital to transfer the cost of this crisis to all types of workers. We see on top of it examples of ways in which capital denies the benefits, if there's benefits of this crisis, and perhaps the plight of the Amazon workers is a case in point. But what I think is important is that whereas all workers can be affected and will need to mobilize to resist this tendency or this attempt, it is clear that some workers are in very different bargaining position, and informal and unenumerated workers in rural areas, I think, require far more attention and visibility that they've received so far. So whereas, and I guess as Ashok was proposing, increasing the structural and associational power of workers and initiatives to in this direction are extremely important for these unenumerated, informal, and to date invisible workers in rural areas. Perhaps visibility would be a first step to ensure that the policies that attempt to tackle the crisis don't continue to simply bypass them, and therefore affecting what could be the poorest of the poorer workers in complex and multi-layered value chains, global value chains.
Thanks, Helena, for that talk. Over to you, Matthew.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm conscious of time, but luckily Professor Kumar has said much of what I was going to say, so I don't have to say it. And it's going to make for a rather boring roundtable. Sorry to go back to the apparel industry, but I agree with much of what he said. So there isn't going to be that much room for intense discussion. But I'm going to be, at the risk of being slightly repetitive, I'm going to recount a little bit of what he said about the structure of global value chains from a slightly different perspective, just to bring out different attributes of this current response. So as he said, you have these global supply chains that are structured with these lead firms subcontracting out to these factories. I'm going to talk about the apparel industry as well. And that structure has been developing over time. And one key element of that structure is that the employment relationship is what David Weil calls fissured, which is you have these large firms that control key elements of design, retail, marketing, and so on. And they've fissured apart from themselves the labor-intensive parts of production. And by doing that, they've created a sort of divide between themselves and these other firms that puts lots of competitive pressure on the firms where a lot of the bulk of manufacturing employment happens, and in turn drives down labor standards for a variety of reasons. And in the apparel industry, this has been globalized, so you have transnational fissuring, and that means that firms or the production's happening in countries with different institutional structures of those that control the capital and key nodes in the production network. So in response to this, there's been all kinds of activist networks engaging in name and shame campaigns that have created a transnational architecture, institutional architecture to address the supply chains. That's a mixture of state-led institutions, so international agreements, trade agreements, conventions, national law, and so-called private regulation, which is regulation among firms themselves, where lead firms that are worried about their reputation adopt codes of conduct and regulate their suppliers. This latter development has been extremely controversial. There's a consensus that it doesn't really work as we would hope and how it's been promised, yet it's still a dominant form, institutional form for regulating this industry. Okay, so as Professor Kumar noted, there's been a shift in this industry where it exploded geographically in the 1990s and 2000s, at the end of the multi-fiber agreement and the accession of the WTO into the of China into the WTO. And then since then, it's been consolidating. And this is the really interesting development. So if you take a firm like Nike, for example, it was increasing the number of suppliers that it had in its base from the 2000s until around 2010, when it peaked out, and then it's cut the number of suppliers that it has in half while it's grown in size. So you have this consolidation, and what that's doing is it's creating more and more big factories, big suppliers, some of the multinational companies themselves doing business with these lead firms. And it's sort of crushing this small tail of factories. And as noted, this has mixed potential for labor. On the one hand, it gives labor, as you rightfully said, the opportunity to bargain with higher margin firms. On the other hand, it creates more powerful suppliers that could fight against labor unions locally, governments, and transnationally, actually buyers that might want to push for improvement in labor standards. Okay, so that's the situation when COVID hits. COVID hits the industry and you get this massive drop off of demand. And factories lose their orders. And as you mentioned, you get massive layoffs around the world at the ends of these supply chains. So 14,000 workers in Ethiopia, 132,000 in Indonesia. Now the BGME is estimating 2.3 million workers have been affected in Bangladesh. The numbers go on and on. It's going to be a long time before we have the full accounting of this. In response, there was a transnational activist campaign to get buyers to pay up for the orders that they had canceled. And some of them refused to pay. That campaign has been led by groups in a number of different countries, and it's been mildly successful, in part because some buyers have seen their financial positions improve and have been worried about their reputations. They've started to pay up. So sort of the initial thing was just to get buyers to pay for what they had ordered, and that has now passed. The question now is what's going to happen next, and this is where we get sort of somewhat more speculative. I agree that the big thing that's going to happen is there's going to be more consolidation in the industry, and I would expect that this crisis is going to accelerate the consolidation, because the brands are going to go back first to those factories that they have stronger relationships with as demand slowly comes back on. And they're going to not go back to that long tail of smaller, more vulnerable suppliers, amplifying the possibility that they're going to go out of business, and just the industry is going to become more and more consolidated. And so you're going to get this greater tiering. I'd like to note really quickly that we're really talking about 10 to 15% of the global market share of the apparel industry here. That's where these big supply chains are located. And there's a whole 85% out there that's local production for local markets, that doesn't travel through these global supply chains. And that those other factories, to the degree that they stay in business, are going to be pushed into that other 85%. And that might actually have really downward pressure on their labor standards. The second thing that's going to happen, or at least I think that's not going to happen, is I would not expect a large change in the geographic distribution of these global value chains. You'll see talk in the media about onshoring in response to COVID. People talk about this. No one in the industry talks about this, as far as I'm aware of. The supply chains are going to snap back into place where they were, with the exception of this consolidation. The other thing that's probably not going to happen is automation. It's only people who are really far from the industry who talk about automation. People who are close, we're just not there yet. So, so more continuity than change, or maybe acceleration in the direction of change that we've seen. And the third thing that is marginal, that is sort of too bad that it's marginal, is I haven't seen yet any major changes in the institutional structure to govern labor standards in the industry in response to this. So if we think about other crises that occurred, most notably the Rana Plaza factory collapse, there was at least an acceleration of new institutional forms of worker-driven regulatory regimes, like the Bangladesh Factory Accord, that came out of that took advantage of that crisis in a way and used that as an opportunity to build newer or slightly different institutional forms. We've seen out of other pressures things like ACT, global union framework agreements. There's institutional change happening, but as far as I can tell, there's been no response to this particular crisis that's created the seeds for a new institutional development in the way this industry is regulated. With the exception of joint statements that have been put out by the ILO, major firms, and major global unions that are calling for government action and financing to help the workers and firms have been badly affected. And my guess is that these moves that were in place beforehand that have been challenging the dominance of private regulation and moving back towards a focus on the state will continue. And they've sort of been brought into relief by the challenges of COVID, but I haven't seen any sort of new institutional entrepreneurship coming that's substantial. So we can hope that the shock of COVID, if and when it passes, does not slow down the processes of moving back towards recentering the state to some degree in governing these industries. But we haven't seen it in massively accelerating either. So I'm conscious of time, and I'm interested to hear what others have to say.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everyone, for your very interesting talks. I think it was interesting to see how all of you kind of emphasized on how this is an unfolding situation, how it reveals the structure of capitalism as it existed before the crisis hit, and how it differed across commodities and geographical regions. So I think that was kind of an interesting spectrum to see. But I think just to start, I feel like I want to pick up on where Matthew ended, which is on the question of the state and the institution, and kind of regulation. And this is I think also a recurring kind of theme and discussion within studies on the global market, on global value chains. Really, what if I could just if you could respond to what do you think the states can do or are doing or are not doing with to respond to these challenges. Do they have any political will or weight to effect any kind of progressive changes at all, or is this sort of all fait accompli as far as kind of states and politics are concerned? So I don't know who would want to start. Matthew, would you?
Sure. I mean, so very quickly, so states, of course, are ever present, right? And they're, the death of this state has been sort of over claimed, and in some ways we see variation in state response that's pretty substantial. So, for example, the UK spent 9% of GDP or so on fiscal response to COVID. Bangladesh spent 3%. Ethiopia spent 2%. This is still unfolding, but the fiscal capacity of the states to respond has been differential, and that's played an important role. And I think what the other thing that is important, although I haven't seen any evidence on the ground from this. I'm talking about this from a pre-COVID point of view. Is if you think about the types of labor market institutions that are in place, the types of employment benefits, of pension benefits, of Social Security benefits, the degree of formalization of employment relationships that exist. Most of that is due to differences in state policy that pre-existed in a sense, and that's going to make a really big difference in the capabilities and abilities of states to deal with this kind of massive employment shock, because it's going to affect what kind of social insurance occurs. And this is maybe again a somewhat of a non-answer, but if you look at data at the firm level of labor standards in major value chains, and you ask what is the one variable that you'd want to explain variation across factories, it would be what country is that factory located in, and what is the local political and institutional context to get there. And that's been a highly dynamic thing that's been changing and will continue to change. And so we'll see how it works out with COVID.
Thanks. Ashok or Helena, would you like to respond to?
I guess, I mean, sorry, Elena, do you want to say something? I think that, yeah, I don't think I have much to add to what Matthew said, but in terms of value chains, the question, really, if you look at it in, for example, I mean, obviously US isn't manufacturing heavy in terms of its relationship to the value chain, but if you look at like other instances within states, for example, in India, how much social insurance was provided was like a direct relationship to the political power of labor versus capital, which allowed them to prioritize workers, for example, to stay at home and have resources sent to them. And I'm thinking of like examples of, say, like Madhya Pradesh versus Kerala. And it becomes a kind of barometer or almost an indictment of the political power of labor versus capital. But also I think it's like, I think if you look at pre-COVID, the political contestation that was involved, and Matthew brought up the question of Nike, and I was talking about the Hugh Yen case, which is the largest shoe manufacturer in the world. 1 in 6 shoes in the world, casual and sports shoes, are produced by Hugh Yen, and they're the kind of exclusive producer for Nike and Adidas. When they went on strike in 2014, which was the largest strike of a private sector employer in Chinese history, in the Pearl River Delta region, you had the state, so the CCP, the Communist Party in China was at the time much more sympathetic, not sympathetic, that's the wrong word, much more, it was part of their ongoing strategy of moving towards more technologically advanced production, whereas the provincial powers, so there was a contestation there between the provincial and the central government. And so I think that in terms of how workers can use these kinds of, I think I basically agree with what Matthew was saying, that actually what we see is the distribution and the response is more about how the states, the political composition of the states and the political power of labor prior to COVID, rather than, I haven't seen any real kind of mobilization necessarily to take advantage of potentially increased structural bargaining power in certain value chains. I'm thinking particularly of like food value chains since COVID. I mean, there's been some examples, Latin American examples, South Africa, but there haven't been that many examples of like sort of workers withdrawing their labor power in strategic parts of the value chain to increase their political power, their power within the value chain.
Perhaps we just add that I think structural power balances do not shift overnight and are perhaps processes that are slower in their transformation. And I also think there's an important mismatch between the ambitions of the type of policies that are being at times implemented, in many instances simply copying from other countries without much attempt at adopting, and the bureaucratic capacity, because in my case, I look at states that are more limited in that respect. So I think there's a great need for policy creativity in thinking of ways of developing interventions that are more impactful in the long term, and that have a greater capacity to penetrate wherever the effects will be felt in the long term as well.
Thank you. I think we have a few questions on the chat. I think some are sort of partially like you've responded to, but if you want to explicitly take the question, which is how can labor use the crisis as a political opportunity? So I think kind of the reverse side of it is how another question, which is how human rights due diligence legislation can be a response from the states to protect workers' rights. Is that something one of you would like to respond to?
Sure. I mean, on the human rights side, I think that there has been a kind of overemphasis, at least in my area of research, which is garments and footwear, on the efficacy of using this kind of discourse. But it's been basically, the empirical evidence shows, I think, that it's been a failure. And to a large extent, the way that, I mean, it's sort of like, you know, Marx writes in Capital Volume 1, where he says that famously, when he's talking about the working day, that, you know, between two rights, force decides. It's not about whether you assert the rights of workers or assert the rights of capitalists. It's that you have the kind of material conditions and subjective agency, and somewhere in the mix, you have the force that determines the distribution of wages. But I think in terms of how workers can disrupt capital, I think, you know, you look at, like, I am sure people will talk about this in other talks that are given in the series, but when you see this rhetoric of essential worker, people are like, oh, we should use that kind of discursively to kind of use that to assert the power of workers. But you soon quickly realize that that's being asserted as a form of nation building, in which they say, this is in lieu of remuneration about how important your work is, we're actually going to say you're essential. So it's actually not necessarily about centering workers and then workers being able to use it. It's about using this kind of symbols of centrality to extract more surplus value. But I think what workers can do is, if you look at, for example, in food supply chains, which I was alluding to earlier, is that, you know, if you look at in the emergence of capitalism, the centrality of food, and I'm thinking of people like E.M. Wood and other people who are arguing about how the centrality of capitalism, particularly in England, and how it emerges is because of the productivity of food, between the high productivity of agriculture between 1500s and 1700s. That means that what you see now is that essential worker, the food supply chain, becomes such an important and critical point of production that it's actually, in certain supply chains, workers could increase their bargaining power quite sharply if they actually withdrew their labor power or did other forms of demands in those workplaces. I think, you know, it's certainly not the case in all supply chains. I mean, garments, there's no indication that workers have more bargaining power after COVID, in the immediacy after COVID, but obviously long term. I just wanted to say one quick thing. I agreed with everything Matthew said in his talk, other than the question of technological advancement. I would say that as you have a technological investment, as you have consolidation, you have increased surplus value at the point of production. It is the case that in sectors that are highly seasonal and tied together with sort of fast fashion trends, that it's much harder to become technologically advanced. But in other parts, I think in the garment sector, so you look at footwear and denim and other places, you've actually seen increased technological advancement. I just wanted to say that before I forgot.
I agree. I don't disagree. I was arguing against the sort of everything's going to be automated, but yes, technology still matters.
Helena, yeah.
Matthew, do you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
No, just for the sake of discussion, I would take issue with Ashok on and on that provocation of what can workers do? Well, workers can associate and can exert a bargaining power. And I wonder if that same caveat that applied to the state in terms of what bureaucratic capacity didn't exist before the crisis cannot be simply wished to, to be instituted as a response to the crisis. I don't think that workers that have not exerted their associational power systematically before can improvise that process. And in this, I think what we need is to deconstruct what we mean by workers and understand that we're dealing with workers of very different characteristics. Some that are highly organized in choke points of these global commodity chains, but some that are extremely fragmented and that don't have the wherewithal to mount resistance. And therefore, the question of the state and the question of social movements and other political technologies is far more important.
Thank you. I think Peter Turnbull has raised a few questions in the chat around kind of sectoral differences. And if you don't mind, Peter, can I invite you to unmute yourself and ask the question if you don't mind, or I could read it out.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering whether, can you hear me? I was just wondering whether or not people have been doing research in the sectors that have had to keep going. And in fact, we become more dependent on certain categories of workers during the crisis, and whether there are any examples in anywhere around the world where workers have actually used that to improve their bargaining power, improve terms and conditions of employment. Because everything we seem to read about is all about concessions and workers being forced to kind of pay for the crisis.
I'm not doing research on it, but you could look at people have been studying the French Amazon workers and fulfillment center workers, and they went on strike. It's not my area of expertise. I know Virginia Delguest at Cornell University ILR School has been at least linked to the people who are doing some of this research, so that might be a place for you to begin. But I haven't seen any other.
I mean, I also I haven't looked at stuff, but I think, but I know that, you saw that there was a kind of increased assertion, like workers were using the language, if you look at of their centrality, but these might have been pre-planned strikes anyways in some cases. So for example, in Italy, auto workers and in metal workers in March and April went on strike. You saw that in pistachio farm workers in California, were threatening strike action, casino workers in Las Vegas. There was warehouse in Canada, also doctors in Sierra Leone. So it's like there were actually many instances in workers were using the language of essential worker in this kind of, you could say, counter-hegemonic way. But I don't know if that, I mean, I do think in some instances that was certainly like the increased pressures, which then became a form of a mechanism by which they could mobilize.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. And I know I'm very conscious of time and we have about a few minutes left. So I just want to ask if there are some kind of last comments that each of the speakers, want to make. I think there is one comment now around social reproduction. Is this something that worker struggles should center on? I think Matthew touched upon it briefly before around, there is not going to be a great shift geographically. I wonder if, this is a kind of sector specific or commodity specific conclusion, because, in agriculture and food, there has been some tendency to, put export bans by some countries. And just this or on any other thing, if I can just open the floor to some final comments. Maybe we start with Helena and
well, no, I think I'll give the turn to Matthew and Ashok while I think.
Okay.
Sure, I'll go ahead. So I think that, the questions about what workers can do and what's possible, I think a lot of the discussion has presented this as a completely zero-sum game. And I think that there are opportunities to think about where this is not a completely zero-sum game between labor and capital. And one of those places, I think, is in a recognition of the importance of state institutions and transnational institutions in addressing the needs of keeping capitalism going. That has become highly salient to everybody. You know, I think most of us who study political economy know that the state didn't disappear, that there are no such thing as sort of stateless markets out there, but the saliency of the role of the state has increased dramatically, and there hopefully has been a resurgence of interest that I think is really there. There was a question in the chat about due diligence legislation. I'm not going to comment on due diligence as a strategy, but the idea of legislation as a strategy, the idea of hard law solutions, of sort of returning to this more state-centric political arena in which some of these battles are fought, and in which there could be positive sum games found and institutional structures of coordination between capital and labor that are made possible. That's where I think maybe we can find a silver lining of hope out of this. But I agree that it's not that state capacity is going to jump up. It's not that institutions are going to jump up. It's that perhaps there's going to be a salience of the state, and that could help existing efforts to recenter the state, and that could help change the nature of these politics somewhat.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think to go off of what Matthew was saying, I think the centering of the state is such an important. I mean, there's lots of problems with it as well, because it erodes a certain form of internationalism that you could find if people were organizing across a supply chain, for example, that's global. But it is universal in the sense that it's not just demands over terms and conditions, and doesn't think about, say like, the workers that aren't in those factories or are in less developed factories or less developed parts of the value chain. I think that there were demands, obviously, especially in the Pearl River Delta region and also in Vietnam, around kind of social reproductive demands around social insurance and pensions that were becoming more and more central because there were more indications of the sort of changing composition of the working class and aging working class, so on and so forth. So I think, but what it does is, I don't want to repeat anything Matthew said, but I agree entirely that it actually, in lots of parts, the state increasingly under neoliberalism was becoming simply the hard edge of capital, right? It's a very militaristic, like the police, the enforcement of getting workers back to work in places like, I'm thinking specifically of Latin America, but also in China and parts of India. So it was to see the state as not simply the repressive arm, but actually distributive through the demands of workers is actually a very important point in which people can actually organize. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Helena?
Yeah, I perhaps would like to add that I think this, Peter's question about to what extent narratives around and realities around essential workers could be translated into actual bargaining power. I think it's not the only reading possible. And I think there are instances in which among essential workers and in these sectors, we see attempts at greater extents of control in the workplace and exploitation. So I don't think I think it's a bit of a more problematic and ambiguous relation. And this brings me back to my kind of like starting point, which is the need to decenter formal workers as the default of analysis of work in global value chains. And in this, I see still great predominance of analysis that is either firm-centric or that takes the formal enumerated worker as a default, which may perhaps be the case more in manufacturing, but we know for certain that in agriculture, informal labor is a very large share of the contribution to labor. That would be.
Thank you. We're also out of time. So let me just thank all our panelists for taking the time out to do this, and everyone in the audience who still hasn't had Zoom and webinar fatigue to joining us and staying with us. Just to say that this is first of our 4-part series. So if you, we hope that you can join the other ones as well. And yeah, you would know where to register. So with that, I'll close here. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.